Hey everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the common questions I get asked, and lately I've been getting asked that question a lot from my clients or people on Facebook, and they've been messaging about it. And one of the things, and this is one of the common recommendation made by dietitians or their primary care physicians or their doctors, and for that matter. So one being diabetic, one of the common recommendations made by either dietitians or someone is to break your meals down. What I mean by that is have small meals throughout the day. Have 5 meals throughout the day. And I want to kind of bust that myth as to that's not the right way to do it, and why that will actually make your diabetes worse. And if you really think about it, ever since people have started doing that, people's diabetes or their blood sugar levels do tend to get out of control, where it gets hard and hard for them to control get their blood sugar levels in normal. So having 5 meals a day, is that ideal for diabetics? And again, that's one of the common recommendations made by doctors, dietitians, or people who want to teach people on how to get their diabetes under control. But that's the worst thing to do. And here's the reason why. So when we talk about type 2 diabetes, so first thing you got to understand, type 2 diabetes is there because your body becomes resistant to insulin. So it's not able to process that insulin properly. So it cannot take the sugar from your bloodstream into your cells. And when that doesn't happen, your blood sugar spikes and you have high blood sugar, and eventually you get diagnosed with diabetic or type 2 diabetes. So that being said, when you understand that, so when do you become resistant to something? Think about it. You know how, I don't know if you've lately been hearing about bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So meaning when your body becomes, when it sees something so much of it, it's going to become resistant to it. So same thing if you talk about antibiotics, because people take so much antibiotics, now when the bacteria that they were trying to treat for, those bacteria are getting smarter and smarter and smarter, and they become resistant to those antibiotics. So therefore antibiotics don't work. This is why we're having those superbugs. Well, same thing goes for insulin. When you have too much insulin running into your bloodstream to take that sugar from your bloodstream into the cells, your cells will become insulin resistant. Does it make sense? So, and again, this is a process that takes years and years and years. This is what they call insulin resistance, which leads to cause of obesity and eventually diabetes. But so it's an insulin resistance that's causing your body to become or have high blood sugars, which eventually leads to diabetes. So that being so, once you understand that, so once the whole process of why body becomes resistant, meaning if you have too much insulin in your bloodstream, your cells will become resistant to it. Just like if you take too much antibiotics all the time, the bad bacteria in your body will become resistant to the antibiotics, and eventually they'll become stronger, and antibiotics won't work. It's the same concept when we talk about insulin resistance. So when you start doing 5 meals a day, now, so one of the common recommendations is hey, break your meals down in 5 meals a day, because then what they say is because if you break your 5 meals, if your meals in 5 meals a day throughout the day, and that goes for weight loss too, not just diabetes, because most of the people who are obese or overweight or who've been there for so many years, the reason they have a hard time losing weight is because their body has become insulin resistant, and that's why people who are obese or overweight are susceptible to get type 2 diabetes, because of the insulin resistance. So when we talk about that, so when we had that insulin constantly, so they talk about breaking the meals down in 5 meals a day. So their idea is, they're saying from perspective that if you eat small meals throughout the day, your blood sugar, because you're putting small meals a day, your body will process it faster or better, I guess, compared to big meal, and therefore your blood sugars will maintain. Now, it's a smart idea, because if you think about it, because if you put less calories rather than putting big meal all at once, but if you're putting small meals throughout the day, your body does have better ability to break those foods down, because it's a small meal, which makes sense, perfectly makes sense. But you got to understand it from perspective of hormones, because insulin is a hormone, right? So when you talk about hormones, so when you talk about insulin, so anytime, even if you put in small meal or big meal, when you put food in your system, what has to happen? The food is going to get broken down, your blood sugar is going to go high, so your pancreas has to release insulin. So what happens now? Your bloodstream has insulin in there. But again, because if you're already diabetic, meaning that's a sign that your body's already resistant to insulin. So now by putting that meal, you're spiking your insulin level all the time. So if you spike your insulin, which is great, but what happens? but your body's already resistant to the insulin. So even if you're spiking your insulin levels, but your body is resistant to it. So again, you're just introducing more and more insulin to your. So by having those 5 meals throughout the day, you're introducing more and more insulin in your bloodstream, which is again increasing your resistance more and more and more. Yes, you're eating less calories, but ultimately to your cells, you're making them actually more resistant because you're constantly introducing more and more insulin in your bloodstream by eating those 5 meals throughout the day. It's almost like if you have an infection, doctor give you antibiotics, you take it, infection goes away, but you don't continuously keep taking the antibiotic every day to just make sure you don't never get an infection. Because if you continuously keep taking the antibiotic every day to prevent that bacteria from coming back, you're doing the worst thing because your body will become resistant to antibiotics. So therefore, you have to change your antibiotics to higher and higher dosage, and eventually none of the antibiotics work, and you end up having, that's where they talk about those superbugs. Well, same concept goes for insulin, because if you're eating 5 meals a day, so every time you put a meal in your body, your insulin spikes. So your insulin spikes, you're already insulin resistant because you're type 2 diabetic. So what happens? Your insulin spikes a lot more. So your blood sugar still, temporarily you might see a drop in when you start on this kind of diets or 5 meals a day diets. Temporarily you may see results, but eventually you don't. Long term, you don't get results. The reason behind it is because the root cause, you're actually making it worse. You're actually making your diabetes worse by eating those 5 meals a day, because every time you're eating meal, you're spiking your insulin, which your body's already resistant to. Now, so second thing you've got to understand is job of insulin hormone is to take the blood sugar or the sugar from your bloodstream into your cell. Now there's a hormone called glucagon. It's also produced by pancreas. The job of glucagon is to take this glucose or the storage energy from your cells and break it down for energy, so you use it for energy, like running. If you're running, you need energy, so it needs to break the glucose. So anything that's stored in your cells, glucagon is the one that takes out. So insulin and glucagon work opposite. So if insulin is high, meaning if your bloodstream has insulin, it cannot have glucagon, and vice versa. But so when you're doing 5 meals a day, so you're constantly putting meals throughout the day, every few hours, your insulin always spikes, always stays up there, so your glucagon never comes up. So you're constantly storing more, again, your cells are resistant. So what happens? The sugar keeps getting stored as fat. So this is not just for diabetics, but if you're obese or overweight, or if you're having really big issues losing weight by doing this 5 meals a day. So when you're constantly putting insulin, the insulin is not taken because your cells are resistant to the insulin. So insulin is not going into your cells. So obviously, what does insulin do? That it kind of binds, so there's extra glucose, which will just get stored as a fat, and you will keep gaining weight, or losing weight will get hard. So we have to bring the insulin down. So the way you make resistance decrease, one of the ways to do it is make sure the insulin doesn't keep spiking up. Because if you're constantly spiking your insulin levels all the time, even if you're eating quality meals, like even if you eat fruits, your insulin will go up, because even though it's good sugar, but your insulin will go up to process that sugar in your bloodstreams. And again, so being insulin resistant makes that insulin hard. So this is why every time you have a meal, those 5 meal diets, they're horrible. You might get results short term, but long term you will not. Diabetes, or losing weight, or obesity, or overweight, whichever your goals may be, but you will not. And especially in diabetes, actually, you will end up making it worse, because by constantly introducing insulin to your bloodstreams by every 2-3 hours when you have a meal, and that's where your body becomes more resistant to it when it was already resistant to the insulin. So it's a big myth. When I say big myth, I mean that's the worst thing you could do when you're doing that 5 meals a day. Yes, again, you will get results short term. Your blood sugars, you might see a change in them short term, but long term, it will not help you. It will actually make it worse, because by having those small meals every 2-3 hours, you're constantly reintroducing insulin in your system, which is one of the major factors your body becoming insulin resistant. Because whatever reason, your body just constantly had insulin spikes all the time. Anytime you had a meal, your insulin would just spike, and your cells like, oh, I can't process all this insulin, and your cells started becoming resistant. So you started either gaining weight and started becoming diabetic. So the 5 meal diets, or breaking the 5 meals throughout the day, is not ideal. Now, if you were to do it, there's one way to do it. You really have to focus on the quality of foods you put in. But even then, it's really, you get into what I call the micros of it, meaning you really have to kind of make sure what you're putting into those meals. But the 5 meals a day, especially when you're trying to just manage your blood sugars, in long run is not good for your diabetes, or losing weight, or gaining more energy. So I hope this was helpful. Take care. Have a blessed day.